The air in the root cellar is thick with the scent of damp earth, sweat, and something metallic and holy, the blood of new life. It clings to the rough-hewn walls, a sacrament of silence, a testament to the body's brutal alchemy. Above, floorboards cry out under the pressure of heavy boots, each groan a sermon on the proximity of death, each footstep a hammer blow against the fragile stillness. The men upstairs are hunting for bodies, for property, for a truth they can bind in chains and drag back into the darkness from which it came. They are loud, confident in their authority, their voices like stones rattling in an iron box. Down here, there is no sound, only the flicker of a single tallow candle, its flame a trembling, golden soul in the oppressive, suffocating dark. A young woman, barely 19, lies on a bed of straw, her body a battlefield where a war has just been won, or perhaps irrevocably lost. Her name is Ruth, and she is a ghost long before she is a corpse, her life force poured out onto the dirt floor to purchase this one impossible moment. But the horror is not her stillness, nor the men above whose profane shouts defile the sacred space of the meeting house. It is the three impossible things she holds in her arms. 3 newborn boys, born minutes ago into a world that wants them dead, and yet they make no sound. Not a cry, not a whimper, not the faintest gasp for air. Their chests rise and fall in perfect, unnatural unison, a silent, synchronized engine of survival. Their eyes, dark and bottomless, are open. They are not staring at their mother's exhausted face, nor at the dancing flame. They are staring at the ceiling, at the source of the noise, as if watching the hunters move through the space above. They are listening, they are aware. In their shared, unblinking, and ancient gaze, a question is born into the suffocating quiet, a question that will haunt this place for a century. What kind of children are born already knowing the price of a single breath? The institution that harbored this impossible birth called itself the Society of Friends, but in the brutal winter of 1856, in the remote pocket of Cedar Mills, Ohio, they were friends to no one but the desperate and the damned. Their God was a quiet one, a presence felt not in thunderous sermons, but in the austere space between words, in the solemn nod of a head, in the shared, crushing burden of a secret that could get them all hanged. Elder Samuel Whitmore, the spiritual, an operational anchor of this silent congregation, was a man carved from the hard Ohio winter itself, his piety a thing of calloused hands, a spine of iron, and a gaze that missed nothing. His meeting house, a simple brick sanctuary dedicated to plain living and silent worship, was a deliberate and holy lie. Its true purpose was not what happened on the polished pews above, but in the cold, hollowed-out earth below. The basement was a masterpiece of righteous deception, a man-made womb for the fugitive, accessed by a trapdoor so cleverly concealed beneath the speaker's platform that Samuel could preach of God's light while standing directly over a dozen souls hiding in the darkness. This was Station 14 on the Underground Railroad, a vital, pulsing artery pumping fugitives north, away from the legal fiction of human property. The air below was always stale with fear, the recycled breath of men and women waiting for a darkness deep enough to travel in. But the fear this February was different. It was sharp, metallic, a living thing with teeth. Professional hunters, the notorious Garrett brothers, roamed the county, their dogs trained to smell freedom as a predator smells a wound. They were not merely enforcers. They were artists of retrieval, men who understood that terror was the most effective tool for dismantling a system built on hope, and they wielded it with surgical precision. The community of Cedar Mills had become a fortress of whispers, every shadow a potential traitor, every unfamiliar face a death sentence waiting to be delivered. Ruth arrived 3 days before the world ended, a specter walking out of the Kentucky. Twilight, a ghost already trailing her own grave clothes. She was 19, she said, her voice a low murmur that seemed to absorb the light from the room, leaving it dimmer. She was heavily pregnant, her belly a taut drum stretched over a secret. She refused to share, a story carried in the deep bruised hollows beneath her eyes. Samuel's wife, Martha, a woman whose faith was practiced in the quiet competence of midwifery and herb lore, knew at once the girl would travel no further. The child was too close, the danger too near. But there was something else about Ruth, an unnerving stillness that went beyond the exhaustion of her journey. She possessed a strange and terrible clarity, an ability to see the hairline fractures in the reality presented to her. She seemed to know things she had no right to know. She would look at a man who brought them supplies and know his name was a lie. She would refuse a portion of bread, and hours later, others would fall sick from the green-black mold hidden deep within its core. It was not prophecy, not the grand, theatrical pronouncements of a seer. It was small, intimate, and deeply unsettling. It was the quiet certainty of one who could see the rot beneath the painted surface of things. "That man," she'd whispered to Martha, her gaze fixed on the empty doorway where a visitor had just stood. "He told you his wife is ill. He lied. He has no wife. He is lonely, and his loneliness makes him careless with the truth." Martha had tried to dismiss it as the understandable paranoia of a fugitive, the mind seeing traps and snares in every corner. But the unease lingered, a cold spot in the heart of the house. Ruth's perception was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same detached, profound sorrow one might use to describe a coming storm. She saw the intricate web of small, necessary lies that held their fragile, righteous world together, and the sight of it seemed to pain her, to slowly, inexorably hollow her out from the inside. The night the boys were born, hell arrived on horseback, its coming announced by a trusted friend, a conductor named Joshua, a man whose courage was legend in the network, burst through the meeting house door, his face a mask of frost and raw terror. "They're coming," he gasped, the words tumbling out in white, panicked puffs of air. Garrett's. They have dogs." Someone talked. The words hung in the frigid air, a death knell that shattered the sanctuary's peace. 8 years of successful defiance, of silent, hard-won victories, undone by a single broken whisper. Samuel felt the cold not in his bones, but in his soul, a deep internal freezing. In the basement were 7 fugitive souls, including Ruth, who had begun the slow, rhythmic dance of labor that afternoon, her body already betraying her to a new internal clock. As Samuel and the other men scrambled to evacuate the 6 others through a hidden tunnel, a dark, claustrophobic passage leading to a distant grove of oaks, a low, guttural moan echoed from beneath the floor. It was time. The world was collapsing. Above, and a new world was fighting to be born below. Martha's face, usually a portrait of stoic calm, went pale. She and her daughter, Rebecca, descended into the earth, into that cramped, desperate space, ready for the familiar struggle of childbirth. But what they found was not familiar. It was alien. Ruth lay on the straw, her body convulsing with contractions, but her face was serene, her eyes closed as if in prayer. She made no sound. Her flesh was a vessel for a storm. She seemed to be observing from a great, impossible distance. It was not a birth. It was a ceremony. A quiet, terrifying ritual unfolding in the heart of the siege, a secret being kept from God himself. Martha, a midwife of 40 years, had never seen anything like it. It was as if the body and the spirit had become 2 separate entities, one racked with the agony of creation, the other floating in a calm, silent abyss, waiting for the precise, appointed moment. "How many?" Martha whispered, her ear pressed against Ruth's swollen, trembling abdomen. The ancient, practical question of all midwives seeking to understand the battle ahead. Ruth's eyes opened. In the sputtering, greasy candlelight, they were not the eyes of a girl in labor. They were dark pools of ancient, sorrowful knowledge, windows into a place beyond pain. 3, she said, her voice impossibly clear and steady, a pronouncement from another realm. 3 boys. They have been waiting for tonight. The words were an absurdity, a madness. Triplets here now? In a root cellar with bloodhounds and bounty hunters closing in? It was a death sentence. But it was her certainty that chilled Martha to the bone. They have been waiting. As if the unborn possessed a will, an intelligence, a timeline orchestrated to coincide with this very horror. Before Martha could process the madness of it, the sound of hoofbeats thundered outside, stopping directly in front of the meeting. House, Samuel's voice, a strained, urgent whisper from above. They are here. The terror from outside seemed to trigger something inside Ruth, a final, convulsive surge. The birth did not just proceed. It accelerated with an unnatural, terrifying velocity. The first boy slipped into the world in absolute, unnerving silence. No cry, no gasp for air. Martha caught him, a perfectly formed child, his eyes already open, alert, his breathing steady and calm, as if he had been breathing for years. He was not a newborn. He was an arrival. Before she could even reach for the linen to cut the cord. The second followed, a mirror image of the first, just as silent, just as eerily aware. A minute later, the third. 3 identical boys, born without a single sound, into a world poised to murder them. It was not a miracle. It was a violation of natural law, a chilling, silent spectacle of engineered survival. The boots were directly overhead now. The heavy, authoritative tread of men who believed in their own righteousness, their own power to own and reclaim flesh. They paced back and forth across the floorboards, their movements charting a map of the hidden space below, each step a threat made manifest. One of them stood directly on the trapdoor, the old wood groaning under his weight, the dust of ages, sifting down through the cracks like a cursed, phantom snow. And in the cramped, suffocating dark of the cellar, the 3 infants lay in their mother's arms, their tiny bodies perfectly still. They did not cry. They did not fidget. They did not make the small, involuntary sounds that all newborns make as they acclimate to the shock of existence. They simply watched, their identical dark eyes moving in perfect, horrifying unison, tracking the sounds from above. It was a conscious act of concealment, a strategic, coordinated silence. They were less than an hour old, yet they understood. The calculus of survival with a clarity that bordered on the monstrous. They knew that sound was death. Ruth, their mother, held them close, her own breathing shallow, her body a shield. She began to whisper to them, not in English, but in a strange flowing language that sounded like no dialect Martha had ever heard. It was a soft, continuous stream of syllables that flowed like water over stones. It was not a lullaby to soothe them. It sounded like an instruction, a transfer of knowledge from one vessel to another. As the Garrett brothers and their men tore apart the meeting house above, searching for their human cargo, a mother was arming her sons with the only weapon they had, an impossible preternatural silence. The hunters could not find what did not announce itself. They were searching for panicked animals, for the scent of fear. They were not prepared for a silence so profound, so intelligent, it was a presence in itself, a void that swallowed their suspicion. For 3 agonizing hours, the world was held in suspension. Above, the methodical violence of the search unfolded. The splintering of wood as a closet was forced open, the guttural commands of the hunters, the frustrated, high-pitched whining of the dogs, who knew something was wrong but could not place it. The animals were agitated, pawing and scratching at the floorboards. confused by the cold earth and the faint, sweet scent of blood that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The men trusted their dogs, but the dogs were failing them. The scent they were trained for, the sweat of terror, the sharp, acrid odor of adrenaline was absent. Down below, there was only a strange, deep calm, a pool of absolute stillness, a silence that was not empty, but full of a coordinated, well, that was actively, intelligently resisting them. Finally, defeated and cursing their informant, the hunters left. Their angry shouts and the fading thunder of their horses were the signal. The moment the last hoofbeat dissolved into the night, the profound silence in the cellar was broken. Not by one cry, but by three. They cried in perfect, horrifying unison, their voices blending into a single, complex chord of release. A haunting, three-part harmony of sorrow and survival. It was the sound of a cage opening. It was the sound of the performance ending. And as their cries filled the small, sacred space, their mother began to die. The bleeding, held at bay by some impossible act of will or forgotten biological mechanism, returned with a terrifying vengeance. Martha fought to stop it, her hands slick with the life pouring out of the young woman, but it was useless. The body had held on just long enough. It had completed its task. Ruth's last words were a whisper, a final instruction meant for Martha alone, a burden passed from the dying to the living. "They will know things," she breathed, her gaze unfocused, already looking past the cellar walls. "Always protect them. But remember, they are not like other children." Ruth's body was buried before sunrise in an unmarked grave. Another secret folded into the cold, unforgiving Ohio earth. The Quaker community was left with the aftermath. Three perfect, motherless, silent boys. They were a legal and spiritual paradox. Slave children born on free soil, yet with no papers, no father, no documented history beyond the bloody straw of their birth. They were ghosts in the system, living contradictions to the laws of men. Samuel Whitmore, a man of God and rigid order, made a decision born of radical faith and pure necessity, one that would redefine the boundaries of his community forever. They would raise the boys, not as orphans, but as sons of the congregation, a shared responsibility, a shared and dangerous secret. They were given simple, strong Quaker names intended to ground them in this new reality: Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac. But from the very beginning, it was clear that Ruth's final fevered warning was not a delusion. It was a prophecy. They were not like other children. The proof was subtle at first, easily dismissed as coincidence by those who did not want to see, who craved normalcy. But Martha Whitmore, who took them into her own home and held the memory of their birth like a hot coal in her heart, saw it all. She began to keep a journal, not of developmental milestones, but of chilling anomalies. At 6 months old, they developed a habit that unnerved everyone. All three would turn their heads at the exact same moment, their gazes locking onto an empty doorway or a vacant corner of the room with an unnerving, focused intensity. Minutes later, someone would appear in that exact spot, always a person wrestling with a hidden turmoil, a quiet grief, a simmering anger, a secret shame they thought was perfectly concealed. The boys didn't just see people approaching. They saw the emotional weather they brought with them. They were tiny human barometers for the storms raging inside the hearts of others. And their silent, knowing stares made the righteous deeply uncomfortable dot by their first birthday, the anomaly, had sharpened from a passive observation into an active tool. The triplets became infallible lie detectors. It wasn't a parlor trick. It was a physical reaction, a fundamental biological rejection of falsehood. When spoken to with honesty, they would gurgle and smile like any other child, their small bodies relaxed and open. But a lie, no matter how small or well-intentioned, created an immediate, visible change. They would turn away in perfect unison, their faces hardening into identical masks of cold, unnerving indifference. They would physically recoil, refusing to be held by the person who had lied. They would not take food from their hand. The community, at first, found it quaint, even useful in a parochial way. A farmhand who claimed to have mended a fence when he had merely propped it up was met with the silent, unified judgment of 3 infants, a condemnation more powerful than any elders. Scolding. A visitor to the meeting house who gave a false name was treated as if he were a leper, the boys creating a perimeter of coldness around him that was impossible to ignore. They became the living, breathing conscience of Cedar Mills, a constant, silent reminder that truth had a texture, a weight, and that they could feel it in their very bones. But the ability went deeper than just spoken words. It was about intent. They reacted to the space between what was said and what was meant, the dissonance between the mask and the face beneath. They could sense the hollow promise, the feigned sympathy, the polite smile that masked a cruel or dismissive thought. Samuel Whitmore, in a letter to his brother, wrote of the growing unease that permeated their devout community. "It is as if the boys can see the soul naked," he confessed, his script tight with anxiety. "And the sight of our ordinary, flawed human natures is a constant source of distress to them. They live in a world without illusion, and I fear it is a terrible, lonely place for a child to be." The boys were a living embodiment of the Quaker ideal of plain truth, but the reality of that truth was a burden that was slowly, silently crushing them. The triplets' uncanny perception was more than a social curiosity. It became a strategic asset. The Underground Railroad, a system built on faith and whispers, was perpetually vulnerable to infiltration. A single traitor, a single informant, could dismantle years of work and send dozens to their deaths or back into bondage. The boys became the network's ultimate security measure. Before a group of fugitives was moved to the next station, they would be brought into the meeting house common room where Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac played. The adults would watch, their hearts in their throats. It was a silent, terrifying interrogation, conducted by 3 toddlers. The boys needed no prompting. They would stop their play and watch the newcomers, their dark eyes moving from face to face. If the fugitives were genuine, the boys would remain calm, sometimes even crawling toward them, offering a wooden block or a piece of string. This was the signal. All clear. But if someone in the group was a plant, a spy sent by the slave catchers, or even just a person whose terror had curdled into a willingness to betray others for their own safety, the boys' reaction was immediate and unmistakable. They would retreat, huddling together in a corner, their bodies rigid, and they would begin to whisper. The strange, flowing language their mother had used on her deathbed would spill from their lips, a soft, sibilant sound that was more chilling than any scream. They were not speaking to each other. It felt as if they were speaking as one, a single consciousness distributed across 3 bodies, analyzing and pronouncing judgment. The system worked with terrifying accuracy. On 3 separate occasions, men who triggered the boys' reaction were quietly separated from their groups and questioned. Under the weight of Samuel's piercing gaze, all 3 confessed to being informants. The triplets had saved dozens of lives, but the cost was becoming visible. They were not children anymore. They were gatekeepers, judges. Their eyes held no innocence, only a weary, ancient knowledge of human frailty. The community that had vowed to protect them began to fear them. It was a quiet, creeping corruption of their good intentions. The boys' gift was a mirror, and no one liked what they saw reflected in it. The small, white lies told to keep the peace, the hidden resentments between neighbors, the secret vanities. And prides the boys saw it all. Their presence enforced a kind of brutal honesty that the community was not prepared for. People began to avoid them. Conversations would halt when the triplets entered a room. Children their own age were wary of them, frightened by their intense, shared gaze and their habit of whispering in their secret language. The boys were becoming profoundly isolated, sealed inside their shared perception. They lived in a world of pure, unfiltered truth, and it was a landscape of horrors. They did not just sense lies about the present. They seemed to be attuned to the echoes of past violence. One afternoon, a traveling preacher stopped at the meeting house, a man with a booming voice and easy smiles. The congregation was charmed by him. The triplets, however, became violently ill in his presence. They vomited and cried, a deep, guttural sobbing that went on for hours. They could not be comforted until the man was gone. 2 weeks later, word reached Cedar Mills from a town further west. The preacher had been arrested. He was a fraud. A man named Silas Kane, wanted in 3 states for the murders of several farm families he had stayed with. He had killed them for their savings, burying their bodies in their own fields. The boys had not just sensed his deception. They had felt the ghosts of his victims. They had been overwhelmed by the psychic stench of his crimes. The incident solidified their reputation, but deepened their isolation. They were no longer just strange. They were vessels for the darkness of the world, and their very bodies were the sites of its terrible manifestations. The other children played games of tag and hide and seek. Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac played a game of survival, navigating a world of invisible wounds and silent screams that only they could perceive. As they grew, their abilities began to expand beyond the immediate and the personal. It started in the winter of 1860, a year of political schism and rising dread. The boys, now 4 years old, began to have episodes of what Martha could only describe distant sorrow. Without any visible trigger, they would become intensely agitated, their small bodies trembling. All 3 would begin to cry, not the petulant wail of a child, but a keening, desolate sound of profound grief, as if they were mourning a loss they couldn't name. The first time it happened, the fit of synchronized weeping lasted for nearly 6 hours. Nothing could console them. They refused food, refused comfort, and simply huddled together, a small trinity of misery. 2 days later, a weary conductor on the railroad brought the news. A family of 11, making a desperate run for the border, had been ambushed and captured by slave catchers 40 miles south. The attack had been brutal, a massacre. It had occurred at the exact time the triplets had begun their strange, inconsolable crying. Coincidence, Samuel told himself, a grim one, but a coincidence nonetheless. But then it happened again. A shorter, more intense burst of shared terror from the boys. The next day, news of a shootout near the river, a brave station master killed defending his charges. The timing, again, was perfect. Dr. William Harrison, the town physician and a man of science, was called in. He was a pragmatist, a skeptic. By trade, he examined the boys during one of these episodes, and his findings, documented in his private notes, were unnerving. Their physiological responses are identical, he wrote. Heart rates, respiratory patterns, even pupil dilation occur in perfect synchrony. It is as if they are not 3 separate individuals experiencing a shared emotion, but a single organism reacting to a single stimulus. A stimulus I cannot identify. The boys were no longer just reading the room. They were reading the entire bleeding landscape of southern Ohio. The burden of this expanded perception was immense. The boys were now living archives of the region's hidden traumas. They were no longer just detectors of individual deceit, but unwilling witnesses to every act of violence and betrayal that occurred within their ever-expanding range. Their childhood was not being stolen from them. It had never existed. They had been born into a state of constant, low-grade horror. Their faces, once round and soft, began to take on a sharp, haunted quality. Their eyes, which had always seemed old, now looked ancient. They rarely played. Their time was spent in silent communion, huddled together, processing the influx of silent screams that only they could hear. The community's fear began to curdle into something more complex, a mixture of awe and resentment. They were a blessing for the railroad, a shield against betrayal. But living with them was like living with a divine judgment. How could you discipline a child for a minor transgression when you knew he could see the secret, ugly thought that motivated your anger? How could you maintain the simple hierarchies of family and community when these three small boys held a knowledge of your soul that you barely possessed yourself? The power dynamic was inverted, and it was deeply unsettling. People started to bring them problems, not as children, but as oracles. A farmer whose prize bull had vanished. A woman who suspected her husband of infidelity. A merchant who had been swindled in a deal. They would stand the boys before the accused, before the grieving, and wait for the knowing look, for the synchronized turn of the head that signaled guilt or truth. They were turning children into a tribunal, their innocence sacrificed for the sake of certainty. Samuel Whitmore tried to stop it, to shield them, but he was fighting a losing battle against human nature's desire for an easy answer, a final verdict. The boys were becoming an institution, and the institution was devouring them. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 shattered the fragile order of the border states and turned the Underground Railroad from a covert network into a theater of open warfare. For the Triplets, now 5 years old, the war was not a distant political event. It was a physical assault. The low hum of regional violence they had always perceived escalated into a constant, deafening roar of psychic static. The sheer scale of the suffering, the terror of young men marching to their deaths, the anguish of families torn apart, the cold, murderous intent of entire armies was a relentless sensory bombardment. They grew thin, pale. They slept in short, fitful bursts, often waking in unison from a shared nightmare. Their abilities, however, became terrifyingly precise. They could now sense not just emotion, but specific events. One morning, Caleb, staring out the window toward the south, announced to Martha in a flat, emotionless voice, "A bridge is burning. Many men are drowning in the river." The report of a Union cavalry skirmish and the collapse of a key railroad bridge 50 miles away arrived 3 days later, confirming every detail. They began to see the movements of troops, not as a map, but as a tide of human feeling waves, of fear, hatred, and grim determination. Their most disturbing new ability was foreknowledge of individual death. They would look at a passing soldier, a young man from the community, marching off to war in a new blue uniform, and they would know. They would turn to each other and whisper their secret language, and a profound shared sadness would settle over them. They saw the when, but not the how, a death date hanging over a person like a shroud only they could perceive. Martha once asked Isaac what it was like. He looked at her with his dark, empty eyes and said, "It is like everyone is already a ghost. We just know the day they will stop pretending they are not." The moral weight of their knowledge became an impossible burden for Samuel Whitmore. What was his duty? If the boys foresaw a man's death, should he tell him? To warn him would be to inflict a unique and terrible cruelty. To stay silent felt like a complicity in the man's fate. He chose silence, and the secret aided him, corroding his faith. The breaking point came in the spring of 1862. A trusted conductor named James Morrison, a man Samuel had worked with for a decade, arrived with a group of 12 fugitives. Morrison was a hero of the network, a man of unimpeachable reputation. But the moment he stepped inside the meeting house, the triplets reacted with a violence no one had ever seen. It was not their usual quiet retreat. It was a primal physical revulsion. All 3 boys began to scream. not crying, but a high-pitched, piercing shriek of pure animal terror. They scrambled backwards, knocking over furniture, their faces contorted. In masks of utter horror, they pointed at Morrison, their small hands trembling. "Death!" they shrieked in unison. "He brings death. He smells of it. So much death." Morrison was stunned, then angered. He tried to approach the boys, to calm them, but they only screamed louder, a terrifying, unholy trinity of accusation. Samuel was trapped. On one side, a decade of trust in a proven ally. On the other, the infallible, terrifying certainty of 3 children who had never been wrong. The 12 fugitives, exhausted and desperate, looked on in confusion and fear. They had been told this was a safe house, a place of sanctuary. Instead, they had walked into a scene of madness, with 3 screaming children at its center. The air was thick with the boys' terror and Morrison's rising indignation. Samuel Whitmore stood between them, a good man facing a choice between 2 impossible truths, knowing that whichever he chose, the consequences would be measured in blood. In the end, human loyalty won out over supernatural certainty. Samuel could not bring himself to believe that Morrison, his friend, was a monster. He saw the 12 desperate faces of the fugitives, men, women, children, and could not turn them away based on the hysterical shrieks of children, no matter how gifted. He rationalized it. The boys were overwrought, the pressures of the war affecting their stability. He made a compromise that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He allowed Morrison and his party to rest and resupply, but he sent 2 of his most trusted men to follow them at a distance when they left the next night. A just in case that was really a confession of his own profound doubt. The Triplets watched the group depart from an upstairs window, their faces pressed against the cold glass. They were silent now, the storm of their terror having passed, leaving behind a chilling, dead calm. "He will take them to the woods by Miller's Creek," Ezra said softly, his voice devoid of all emotion. "He will call to his friends in the trees, the ones with the guns." Isaac nodded, his gaze fixed on the retreating figures. "They will not all die. The strong ones will be worth more alive." The boys were not predicting a possibility. They were narrating a memory of the future. The next morning, Samuel's 2 men returned, their faces ashen, their eyes hollow with what they had seen. It had happened exactly as the boys had said. At Miller's Creek, Morrison had given a signal. Armed slave catchers had emerged from the darkness. It was an ambush, a slaughter. 7 of the fugitives were shot down where they stood, including 2 children. The remaining 5 were beaten and chained. And James Morrison, the hero, the trusted friend, was seen accepting a heavy purse of coins from the leader of the bounty hunters before riding off with them. He had been a double agent for months, selling souls for silver. The news of the massacre at Miller's Creek descended on the Cedar Mills community like a plague. 7 dead, 5 re-enslaved. A decade of trust revealed as a monstrous lie. The collective guilt was a physical weight, a sickness in the air. They had been warned. They had been given the pure, unvarnished truth, and they had rejected it in favor of a comfortable, familiar falsehood. The Triplets' reaction to the news was the most terrifying part of all. There was no, "I told you so," no anger. Instead, for the first time, they showed an emotion that was recognizably human, yet terrifying in its depth. It was a profound, weary disappointment. Not just in Samuel or in Morrison, but in the very nature of mankind. Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac stood before the weeping congregation, their small forms casting long shadows in the morning light. It was Isaac who finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, each word a perfectly polished stone of judgment. "You didn't listen," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a simple statement of a fundamental law. People never listen. They want to believe the story they like, not the one that is true. He paused, his dark eyes sweeping over the faces of the adults, the good, pious people who had raised him. We see the darkness in everyone, the small rot, the secret selfishness. We have always seen it. We thought it was our burden to see. But now we understand. The burden is not ours. It is yours for not seeing. In that moment, the final thread of their childhood broke. They were no longer the community's strange sons. They were something other. Something that stood apart, watching, judging, and remembering. The body of the community had been betrayed, its trust mutilated. And the psychic wound would never fully heal. If you're still with me, type "the body remembers" in the comments. Let me know you've passed the threshold. The aftermath of the Millers Creek massacre was a period of cold, silent decay. The boys retreated even further into their shared consciousness, their bond with the community irrevocably severed. They had offered up a truth that could have saved lives, and the world had refused it. Their disappointment was not emotional. It was elemental, a geological shift in their understanding of their place in the world. They stopped warning people. They continued to see the betrayals, the coming violence, the secret sicknesses of the soul, but they kept it to themselves. Their knowledge was now a private scripture, shared only in the silent, flickering language of their synchronized gazes and the soft, watery whispers of their mother's tongue. They had become a nation of three with closed borders. Their isolation was now a policy, not just a condition. They moved through the meeting house like ghosts, their presence a constant, silent reproach. The Quakers, in turn, treated them with a new kind of fearful reverence. They were no longer oracles to be consulted, but holy relics too dangerous to touch. They were fed, clothed, and sheltered, but they were no longer loved. They were feared. The institutional cruelty of this arrangement was masked as piety and respect. The boys were given their own room, their own space, not for their comfort, but for the community's. They were being quarantined. The house of God had become a gilded cage for its three most unwelcome miracles. They were living symbols of the community's failure, of the limits of their faith. And every day, their silent, watchful presence reminded the people of Cedar Mills that their simple, honest world was built on a foundation of secrets and lies that only the children could see. Their bodies were no longer just detectors. They were repositories of all the unspoken truths, and the weight of that archive was transforming them into something hard and permanent. Like fossilized wood dot in the fall of 1862, a new and more dangerous institution turned its gaze toward Cedar Mills. It was not the church, nor the law, but the cold, hungry engine of military science. A letter arrived from the Medical College of Ohio, bearing the seal of the Union Army. It was from a Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the nation's first female physicians and a pioneering researcher in the nascent field of neurology. She had come across the late Dr. Harrison's scattered notes on the Cedar Mills anomalies, and, backed by the authority of a government desperate for any wartime advantage, she was coming to study them. Dr. Hartwell was not a simple country doctor. She was a woman of formidable intellect and ambition, a product of a new age that believed every mystery could be dissected, classified, and ultimately controlled. She arrived not with kindness, but with instruments. Galvanometers, chronoscopes, calipers. She saw the boys not as children, but as a puzzle, a biological novelty to be solved. Samuel Whitmore, weakened by his own guilt and intimidated by the authority she represented, allowed it. He convinced himself it was for their own good, a way to understand God's strange creation. But the boys knew better. They saw the truth behind her professional curiosity. She did not want to understand them. She wanted to own their mystery. She wanted to translate their existence into the cold, dead language of science, to pin their souls to a specimen board. The examinations were a new kind of violation. The boys were separated, placed in different rooms, a deliberate attempt to break their shared consciousness. Dr. Hartwell subjected them to tests, measuring their responses to electrical stimuli, to sudden sounds, to carefully constructed lies told by her assistants. She was methodical, precise, and utterly blind to the true nature of what she was studying. She was trying to measure a soul with a ruler. Dr. Hartwell's experiments, though crude, yielded results that were, in her words, categorically impossible. Her report, classified by the War Department and buried for 60 years, detailed the chilling efficiency of the boys' connection. When she applied a mild, painful electrical current to Caleb's arm in one room, Ezra and Isaac, isolated and unaware in other parts of the house, registered an identical spike in heart rate and galvanic skin response at the exact same instant. They felt his pain as if it were their own. Their nervous systems were not just similar, they were networked. They were a single, distributed consciousness. She discovered that their ability to detect lies was not psychological. It was physiological. Her sensitive galvanometers registered minute fluctuations in the electromagnetic field around a person who was speaking. These fluctuations were imperceptible to any normal human, but the triplets reacted to them as if they were a physical touch. They were not reading body language. They were directly perceiving the electrical signature of human thought. When a subject formulates a deception, Hartwell wrote in her secret report, a distinct and measurable cascade of neural activity occurs. This activity generates a specific chaotic electromagnetic signature. The subjects Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac appear to possess a form of biological sensitivity to these fields. They do not deduce a lie. They feel it, as one might feel a change in temperature or pressure. They are, in essence, living oscilloscopes for the human conscience. She had found the mechanism, the biological gears behind the miracle. But in doing so, she had stripped it of its mystery and recast it as a potential weapon. An infallible human lie detector would be an invaluable tool for military interrogations, for rooting out spies, for enforcing loyalty. The boys were no longer a spiritual mystery. They were a strategic asset. The most damning discovery came from the grave itself. Under the authority of her military commission, Dr. Hartwell ordered the exhumation of Ruth's body. The Quakers protested this desecration, but their objections were swept aside by the needs of the state. In the cold clinical setting of a makeshift laboratory, Hartwell conducted an autopsy. What she found provided the final horrifying piece of the puzzle. Ruth's tissues were saturated with a cocktail of heavy metals and industrial toxins. Mercury, lead, arsenic. Specifically, the chemical signature matched the compounds used in the large-scale production of indigo dyes on the vast, brutal plantations of the Deep South. Ruth had not just been a slave. She had likely been forced to work in the dye vats, a notoriously dangerous and often lethal assignment. She had spent her pregnancy breathing in a chemical soup designed to fix color to fabric, and it had fixed itself to her unborn children's DNA instead. The toxins that had slowly poisoned her had triggered a violent, chaotic mutation in her sons. It was a 1 in a billion chance, a roll of the genetic dice that should have resulted in death or severe deformity. Instead, it had unlocked a dormant potential in the human genome. It had created a new kind of perception. The boy's gift was not a gift from God. It was an industrial accident, a byproduct of the slave economy's relentless cruelty. Their supernatural ability was born from the most profane of origins: a master's profits, a supervisor's whip, and a young woman's poisoned body. The body, as it always does, had kept the score. The very system that had enslaved their mother had, in its blind, chemical brutality, created the weapon that could see its every lie. Dr. Hartwell's final conclusion, reserved for the most secret. Addendum to her report was a vision of the future that was both terrifying and seductive. The mutation was dominant. The genetic changes that created the boys' electromagnetic sensitivity were not a fluke that would end with them. They would be passed on. We are witnessing the birth of a new and potentially superior branch of the human species, she wrote, her scientific prose barely concealing a chilling eugenic excitement. Homo sapiens perceptus, a human with the innate ability to perceive the truth. Their descendants will carry this trait. It is likely that with each generation, the sensitivity will refine, the range will increase. Within a century, their lineage could produce individuals capable of perceiving not just lies, but complex thoughts, memories, emotions. A true telepath, born not of myth, but of chemistry and trauma. The implications were staggering. A ruling class of natural lie detectors. A society where privacy was impossible, where every thought was transparent to a select, gifted few. It was the ultimate tool of control, the final solution to the problem of descent. But for the boys, the immediate future was far more grim. The War Department was not interested in century-long evolutionary theories. They were interested in results. In the winter of 1863, the order came down. Federal marshals were dispatched to Cedar Mills with a warrant to take Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac into federal custody. They were to be transported to a secure facility in Washington, D.C., for further study and deployment in matters of national security. They were no longer children. They were no longer anomalies. They were property of the state. The institution of the church had failed to contain them. The institution of science had defined them. Now, the institution of government was coming to claim them. But you cannot cage something that can see the bars being forged from 100 miles away. The marshals were still a day's ride from Cedar Mills when the boys made their move. They had felt the shift in the bureaucratic machinery, the cold, metallic intent of the order that had been signed in Washington. They had perceived the approach of the government men, not as the sound of horses, but as a wave of cold, purposeful authority rolling across the Ohio landscape. That evening, as Samuel Whitmore sat by the fire, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, the three boys entered the room. They were 7 years old, but their eyes held the weary resolve of old men. They carried small, pathetic bundles of their belongings, a change of clothes, a worn wooden toy, a small Bible. They were leaving. Caleb, the unspoken leader, spoke for the three of them. "We cannot stay," he said, his voice flat and final. "The men who are coming do not want to help us. They want to use us. Then they will want to cut us open to see how we work." Isaac, the most sensitive, the one who felt the world's pain most keenly, added, "And when they are done with us, they will search for our children. And their children, they want to own what we are, forever." Samuel, his soul already burdened with the guilt of Miller's Creek, begged them to stay. He promised protection, sanctuary. He argued that the government was a lesser evil than the wilderness. In winter, Ezra, the silent observer, looked at the old man with a pity that was more devastating than any anger. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice a soft whisper, "you still believe in the goodness of institutions. We do not. We see the thoughts of the men who are coming. We know what they will do in the name of order. We would rather trust the wolves." Before they slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness, vanishing into the network of caves and forgotten trails that riddled the Ohio hills, the boys left Samuel with one final shattering revelation. It was Isaac who spoke, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the room. "We are not the only ones," he said. The words hung in the air, a quiet explosion. "There are others, born in times of great suffering, in places where the water is poison or the air is sick with the smoke of industry. Children whose mothers carried the same pain, the same poisons that made us." Caleb continued, picking up the thread of the shared thought. They are scattered. Most do not know what they are. They think they are just lucky or intuitive or cursed. They cannot hear each other yet. Their senses are still sleeping. But we can feel them, faintly, like single, lonely sparks in the darkness. It was a staggering concept. A hidden diaspora of mutated children. A secret emergent species. Born from the wounds of the industrial age. They were the unintended consequence of progress, the psychic fallout of a world that valued production over people. Ezra, the quietist, delivered the final part of the prophecy, a promise that was also a threat. One day we will find them. We will teach them to use what they have, to control it. We will build a nation of our own, a silent one. And we will be ready when the world of lies finally collapses under its own weight. And with that, they were gone. They stepped out of the meeting house and into the frozen landscape, 3 small figures swallowed by the immense, indifferent darkness. The federal marshals arrived hours later to find an empty room, a cold hearth, and the lingering, palpable silence of 3 children who had chosen exile over exploitation. The search was extensive, but it was useless. They were looking for children. They did not understand. They were hunting for ghosts who could see them coming. The legacy of the boys' disappearance haunted Cedar Mills, becoming a cautionary tale whispered by the fire. The community withered, its central purpose gone, its moral certainty shattered. The Underground Railroad, without its infallible detectors, became vulnerable again. Several more conductors were caught and hanged. The meeting house itself slowly fell into ruin, a hollowed-out monument to a failed miracle. Samuel Whitmore lived into old age, a man tormented by what he had witnessed. His final writings, discovered long after his death, were the ravings of a man caught between faith and a terrible empirical truth. "I have seen the face of the next evolution," he wrote, "and it was born in a slave's womb and baptized in the poisons of our own making. God forgive us. We sought to build a new Zion, and instead we became the midwives to a new kind of man, one who can see our souls and finds them wanting." Dr. Hartwell's career flourished, though her report was buried. Her expertise in neurological interrogation techniques was highly valued by the government. She became a quiet architect of a new kind of institutional power, one based on the scientific classification and control of the human mind. She never spoke of the boys again, but the shadow of their impossible biology shaped her life's work. She spent decades searching for another anomaly, another key to unlocking the power she had briefly touched, but she never found one. The world, it seemed, was not yet ready to mass-produce its own executioners of deceit. The boys had been a singular event, a perfect storm of genetics, trauma, and chemistry. Or so she believed. But the boys' prophecy had been real. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century and into the 20th, whispers began to surface. A girl in the coal-choked valleys of Pennsylvania who could predict mining collapses with unnerving accuracy, saving her father and his crew twice. A set of withdrawn twin boys in the Texas Panhandle, sons of a sharecropper who could locate lost cattle over vast distances simply by feeling where they were. A quiet, solitary child in a Chicago slum, living near a lead smelter, who was known in his neighborhood as the truth-teller, a boy who could not be lied to, and whose gaze was said to cause physical pain to the dishonest. These were isolated. Stories dismissed as folklore, rural superstition, or childhood fantasy. No one connected the dots. No one saw the pattern that Dr. Hartwell had identified and the government had buried. The children were always born in places of profound environmental or social stress, industrial wastelands, impoverished communities, regions scarred by conflict. Their parents were the poor, the marginalized, the ones who lived closest to the poison. They were the children of the sacrifice zones, their bodies carrying the signature of the nation's hidden costs. Most of them never understood their own abilities. Their strange intuitions were a source of confusion and shame, a mark of otherness that they learned to suppress. They were lonely sparks, just as the triplets had foreseen, burning in the darkness. Unaware of each other's existence, the science took a century to catch up to the reality. In the late 20th century, the field of epigenetics began to confirm what Ruth's poisoned body had demonstrated in 1856. Extreme environmental stress from toxins, from malnutrition, from sustained terror could indeed trigger rapid, heritable changes to the genome. Trauma could be passed down, not just psychologically, but biologically. The body keeps the score, and sometimes the score is written in the very code of life itself. Modern neurologists studying rare cases of extreme sensory perception began to identify the same patterns Dr. Hartwell had seen. They found individuals with an abnormal sensitivity to low-frequency electromagnetic fields, the same fields generated by human neural activity. They called it electromagnetic hypersensitivity syndrome and treated it as a disorder. But a few researchers working on the fringes began to ask a different question. What if it wasn't a disorder? What if it was an adaptation? An enhanced sense, like hearing or sight, emerging in response to a world saturated with new kinds of invisible information and new kinds of invisible threats? They had given the phenomenon a name, but they had missed its meaning. They were medicalizing a revolution. They were treating the next step in human evolution as a disease, the ultimate act of institutional blindness. The system could not comprehend a power it had not sanctioned, so it labeled it as sick. In 2003, the past reached out to touch the present. During the renovation of an old farmhouse, less than 20 miles from the site of the original cedar mills, Meeting House, a construction crew broke through a false wall in the cellar. Behind it, they found a small lead-lined box. Inside, preserved from the ravages of time, were a collection of documents. There were detailed genealogical charts, written in 3 distinct but coordinated hands, tracing the family lines of Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac Whitmore. The charts showed they had not only survived, but thrived. They had moved west, changed their names, and integrated into the fabric of the growing nation. They had married, had children, and their children had children. The genetic trait, the knowing, had been passed down, just as Hartwell had predicted. The families had spread across the country, a silent, invisible network of cousins, a hidden lineage. But it was the other document in the box that turned the discovery from a historical curiosity into something far more terrifying. It was a letter, dated 1923, addressed to those who come after. In it, the descendants of the original triplets, detailed with chilling and perfect accuracy a series of future historical events. The stock market crash of 1929, the rise of a dictator in Germany, a war that would be fought with a weapon that could burn the sky, the year a man would walk on the moon. Dozens of predictions, all of which had come to pass. They were not just seeing lies. They were seeing time itself. The letter was a testament to an ability that had not just been preserved, but had grown in power and precision with each generation. The range of their perception had expanded beyond the immediate, beyond human emotion, into the very structure of probability and consequence. They were no longer just reading people. They were reading the causal chains of history. The letter concluded with a passage that has become the focus of intense, clandestine study by the very few who know of its existence. Our family has remained hidden, for the world of men is not yet ready for a truth it cannot control. You build systems of power on secrets and acceptable losses. Our existence is a threat to that foundation. We have learned to shield ourselves, to appear ordinary, to live within your world, but not be of it. We are your neighbors, your colleagues, your friends. We watch, we learn, and we wait. The time is coming when the systems of deceit will become too complex, the weight of lies too heavy for your civilization to bear. The structure will collapse. On that day, we will be ready, not to rule, but to guide, not to command, but to reveal. The next stage of human history cannot be built on falsehood. We are the architects of what comes next. It was signed not with a name, but with a title, the trustees of the Cedar Mills legacy. It was a declaration of intent from a hidden, parallel humanity. The existence of the letter and the genealogies created a silent, frantic search. Covert agencies, powerful private collectors, and a handful of academics began a hunt for the living. Descendants. But how do you find people who can sense your intention to find them? How do you lay a trap for someone who can see the blueprint of the trap in your mind? The searchers were always one step behind. They would identify a potential descendant, only to find they had moved weeks earlier, leaving no forwarding address. They would try to set up surveillance, only to have their equipment mysteriously fail at critical moments. The descendants were like ghosts in the machine of the modern world. They seemed to possess a collective, coordinated ability to evade detection, a herd instinct that operated on a level of perception that was incomprehensible to their hunters. The hunters were using technology, data analysis, and brute force. The hunted were using a sense that was woven into the fabric of reality itself. It was a war fought in the shadows, a conflict between two different species of human, one defined by the power to control information, the other by the power to perceive truth. The descendants were not just hiding. They were demonstrating their superiority. Their evasion was a message. You cannot find us unless we wish to be found. The power dynamic had been permanently inverted. The institution was now the blind one, stumbling in the dark, hunting for a light it could not comprehend. And then one day they chose to be found. A select group of individuals, historians who had studied the original case, neurologists researching electromagnetic sensitivity, a few disillusioned intelligence analysts received an anonymous, encrypted email. It contained a single GPS coordinate pointing to a remote, unassuming community center in rural Ohio. It also contained a date, February 23rd, the anniversary of the triplets' birth, and a simple message: the body remembers, the legacy endures. Come and see. It was an invitation, a summons. After more than a century and a half of silence, the descendants were opening a door, not to the world, but to a chosen few they had been observing, people they had judged worthy of a glimpse behind the curtain. The gathering was quiet, unremarkable to any outside observer. About 50 people met in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic revelations. The hosts, the descendants, were impossible to distinguish from the guests. They were ordinary-looking men and women teachers, mechanics, programmers, nurses. But when they spoke, the air in the room changed. They spoke of the burden of their gift, the constant noise of emotional static, the pain of seeing the secret griefs and cruelties that people carried. They spoke of the responsibility to their lineage, to protect the gift and to prepare for a time when it would be needed. They demonstrated their abilities in small, subtle ways. A woman looked at a historian and gently asked him about his unspoken fear that his wife's cancer had returned. A young man looked at a former NSA analyst and described, in perfect detail, a classified operation from a decade earlier, a memory the analyst had never spoken of to anyone. What was revealed at that meeting was not a plan for global domination, but something far more subtle and profound. The descendants were not building an army. They were building an ark. They believed that global civilization, built on complex, interconnected systems of economic and political lies, was heading for an inevitable, catastrophic collapse. A truth singularity, they called it, a point where the lies would become so numerous and contradictory that the entire system would crash, unable to process its own deceptions. They were preparing for what came after. They were creating a living archive of truth, a human library of skills, knowledge, and history, uncorrupted by falsehood. They were cultivating their abilities, not to control others, but to build a foundation for a new kind of society where empathy was a sense, not an effort, and trust was not a choice, but a verifiable fact. Their network was a safety net for humanity's future. They were engaged in what they called psychic conservation, finding and protecting others like them, teaching young children how to manage the sensory overload and how to use their abilities, to heal rather than to judge. They were not waiting for the world to burn. They were tending the embers from which a new one might be lit. The guests left that meeting changed, shaken to their core. They had been shown a truth not just about a hidden history, but about the possible future of human consciousness itself. They had been made witnesses, and now they, too, had a secret to keep. The story of the Cedar Mills triplets is not a ghost story from the 19th century. It is a prologue. It is the origin myth of a new chapter in the human story that is unfolding. In the shadows of our own time, the questions raised by their birth in that cold, dark cellar are no longer historical. They are immediate. What does it mean for humanity if the ability to perceive truth becomes a biological trait, possessed by some, but not all? Who guards the guardians? And what happens when a species, for the first time, is forced to confront a version of itself that is fundamentally, provably, superior in its perception of reality? We live in a world drowning in information, but starved of truth. We build technologies to connect us, yet we have never been more isolated in our own subjective realities. The legacy of Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac suggests that the answer to our crisis will not come from a machine. It may come from within, a change in our own biology, born from the crucible of our own self-inflicted wounds. We do not know what the descendants are planning now. We do not know when their predicted collapse will come. We only know that they are out there, watching, waiting, a silent, invisible nation of truth-seers, living among us, their bodies a living testament to the fact that history never forgets, and that the body, in the end, always, always remembers.